You begin at the edge of the Mediterranean, where the light falls softly across the water, and the long curve of Alexandria opens before you. The sea is the first thing you notice. It is wide, calm, and ancient in its own way, breathing against the shore, as it has for thousands of years. You stand here, and almost at once you understand that Alexandria is not a city you simply look at. It is a city you listen to. It is a city you remember, even before you know it well. As you face the water, you are facing more than a horizon. You are facing an entrance into layers of time. Beneath the streets, beneath the modern buildings, beneath the traffic and the salt air, there are other Alexandrias still waiting. Greek Alexandria, Roman Alexandria, Christian Alexandria, Islamic Alexandria, Ottoman Alexandria, modern Egyptian Alexandria. They do not sit neatly apart from one another. They overlap, they echo, they rise and fade like the tide. And so, before you take a single step, you paused and let the place settle around you. The wind comes in from the sea, the air carries salt, distant and memory. Somewhere behind you, the modern city moves with all its noise and urgency. But here, at the water's edge, history feels slower, broader, more human. Yeah, you are not beginning a walk through one city. You are beginning a walk through many cities, all of them called Alexandria. Now you walk to Fort Kite Bay, where the stone walls rise above the meeting place of sea and harbor, and where Alexandria seems to gather its memory into one commanding point. You feel the wind first. It presses lightly against your face, carrying salt, distance, and the faint sense that ships are always arriving, even when none are in sight. You stand where one of the greatest monuments of the ancient world once stood. Long before this fort watched the coast, the Pharos Lighthouse lifted its height above the harbor, sending fire and reflected light across the Mediterranean night. Sailors looked for it from far away. Merchants trusted it. Rulers admired it. Travelers carried stories of it into other lands until Alexandria itself became inseparable from the image of a tower standing against the sky. And yet, what you see now belongs to another century, another struggle, another Alexandria. The Mamluks built this fort in the 15th century, shaping a fortress from a place already heavy with history. Stone replaced stone. Defense replaced wonder. But the older presence never fully vanished. Even now, as you look from the walls toward the restless water, it is easy to imagine the lighthouse here, brighter than the stars, declaring that this city was made to be seen. This is where Alexandria truly begins to reveal its ambition. Yeah, founded in 331 BCE under Alexander the Great, the city was never meant to be provincial or hidden. It was designed as a meeting point of worlds, where Egypt opened toward the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean opened back toward Egypt. The harbor was not an accident of geography, it was the center of a vision. So as you stand at Fort Kite Bay, you are standing in two cities at once. The fortified city that survived, and the luminous city that first announced Alexandria to the world. From the harbor, you turn your gaze toward waters that conceal what was once the royal heart of Alexandria. The sea looks smooth enough now, but beneath and beyond it lay palaces, quays, colonnades, courtyards, and ceremonial spaces where the Ptolemies ruled Egypt in the generations after Alexander. Much of that world has vanished from ordinary sight. Some of it sank. Some of it was broken apart by time and earthquake, conquest, and reuse. Yet Alexandria asks you to do something unusual as you stand here. It asks you to imagine with discipline, You picture the royal quarter not as a myth, but as a functioning center of power. Officials moved through its halls. Messengers arrived from distant provinces. Priests, scholars, sailors, merchants, and envoys all passed through a city built to gather influence from every direction. The streets were ordered, the port alive, and the court determined to project wealth, authority, and learning at once. It is here that the dream of knowledge takes its most famous form. Somewhere within this larger royal and intellectual world stood the Mausoleum and the great library, institutions that later generations would remember with almost sacred awe. You do not need to imagine a silent modern library. Instead, think of a living center of study, translation, comparison, argument, and collection. Scrolls arrived from across the known world. Languages met one another here. Scholars read, copied, debated, measured, classified, and taught. Alexandria became a place where knowledge itself was treated as a form of power, and that is why this lost quarter still matters. Its ruins are not only architectural, they are symbolic. You are looking toward a vanished landscape that once tried to gather the world into words, numbers, maps, and memory. In this city, empire and intellect stood close together. Ships brought grain and papyrus, but they also brought ideas. The result was a capital that wanted not only to rule the world, but to understand it. As you stand above the water, looking over what can no longer be fully seen, you begin to understand one of Alexandria's deepest truths. Some cities leave behind monuments, but Alexandria also leaves behind an appetite of the mind. You remain by the harbor, but the mood changes now. The wind still moves across the water. The light still breaks against the surface. Yet Alexandria becomes less like a city of scholars and more like a stage on which empires watched one another. Here, power was displayed as carefully as architecture. Here, rulers understood that appearance could shape destiny. When you think of Cleopatra's Alexandria, you are thinking of a city that knew how to perform magnificence. Cleopatra the Seventh was not simply a queen wrapped in legend. She was a strategist, a ruler, and a political actor working inside a dangerous Mediterranean world. From this city, she negotiated with Rome, managed alliances, and tried to preserve the last great Hellenistic kingdom against forces that were already closing around her. The city became the setting for encounters with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, and in those encounters, Alexandria was never merely a background. It was part of the message, wealthy, theatrical, seductive, and politically essential. Every ceremony, every arrival, every public gesture carried meaning. But cities tied to great ambition are also tied to great risk. The struggle between Cleopatra and Octavian drew Alexandria into the final contest that ended the age of the Ptolemies. When defeat came in 30 BCE, it was not only a ruler who fell, an era fell with her. The last chapter of independent Hellenistic Alexandria closed, and Roman Alexandria began. So as you look over the harbor, you're looking at water that once reflected both splendor and catastrophe. Alexandria did not die with Cleopatra, but after her, it belonged to a different world, and history turned decisively here. Now you leave behind the vanished palaces and come to Commeldicca, where Alexandria changes from royal memory into surviving stone. Here, the city feels closer to the ground. You are no longer imagining only kings and queens, but ordinary movement. Footsteps on paving, voices in public spaces, merchants calling out, students listening, citizens gathering. in the heat of the day. The remains here belong to a Roman Alexandria, a city that did not lose its importance when Rome took control. On the contrary, it remained one of the great urban centers of the empire. Grain moved from Egypt outward. Wealth moved through the harbor. Officials, traders, sailors, laborers, philosophers, and travelers all passed through streets dense with language, custom, and ambition. At Commeldica, the stone seats of the small Roman theater still hold their curve, and the urban remains around it suggest a city organized for public life. You can picture lectures, performances, announcements, and argument. You can imagine bathhouses filled with conversation, courtyards alive with exchange, and workshops where labor shaped the city hour by hour. Roman Alexandria was not a relic of earlier greatness. It was active, crowded, and essential. What makes this place powerful is its nearness to daily life. The royal quarter belonged to ceremony and spectacle. But Commeldica reminds you that Alexandria was also built by routine. People studied here, they traded here, they negotiated, learned, rested, argued, and earned their living here. The empire depended on cities like this, and few mattered more than Alexandria. So as you stand among these remains, you begin to hear the city differently, not only as a place of famous rulers or legendary institutions, but as a living Roman metropolis busy from morning until night, carrying goods, ideas, and human effort in every direction at once. Yet you come next to Pompey's pillar, rising solitary and severe above the city, and at once the mood of Alexandria shifts again. This is not the harbor of royal display, nor the civic rhythm of Commeldica. Here you feel the weight of argument, conviction, and struggle. A single column survives where a larger sacred landscape once stood, and that survival tells you something important about Alexandria. Every age leaves marks, but not every age keeps its world intact. The pillar stands near the site of the Serapeum, once one of the most important religious centers in the city. This was a place tied to Serapis, a god shaped in part to speak to both Greek and Egyptian traditions. And in that alone, you can see Alexandria's old genius for blending worlds. Yet the city's brilliance did not make it peaceful. The same energy that produced learning, exchange, and invention also produced rivalry, urgency, and fierce belief. By late antiquity, Alexandria had become one of the great centers of Christian thought, and the city's religious life grew sharper, more public, and more contested. Pagan tradition still survived, imperial authorities still mattered, philosophical schools still taught, but the ground was shifting. Old temples no longer belonged securely to the future, and new forms of faith were reshaping the streets, the institutions, and the public imagination. So when you stand before this surviving pillar, you are not looking only at a monument. You're looking at a witness to transformation. The Serapeum belonged to a world that once seemed enduring, learned, and sacred, yet even that world could be broken apart. Alexandria did not lose its intensity as it changed. It carried that intensity forward into new struggles, and that is what this place makes you feel most clearly. In Alexandria, ideas were never abstract. They were lived, defended, contested, and sometimes destroyed. You come now to one of the most haunted names in Alexandria's history, Hypatia. Even if the stones around you do not preserve her classroom or her voice, the city still carries her shadow. She was a philosopher, a mathematician, and a teacher. formed by a world in which learning still mattered deeply even as the society around her grew more divided, more suspicious, and more violent. To think about Hypatia is to think about a city still alive with study and debate. Alexandria had not abandoned the life of the mind. Teachers still explained difficult texts. Students still gathered to listen. Ideas still moved through streets already crowded with religious passion and political tension. But that tension had become dangerous. Public life was no longer only argumentative. It could become ruthless. Hypatia's death in 415 CE has endured in memory not only because it was brutal, but because it seemed to reveal a deeper fracture in the city. In her, later generations saw the image of classical learning caught inside a world, changing faster than reason could calm it. Whether remembered as philosopher, martyr, or symbol, she came to represent a terrible truth. Great cities do not lose their greatness all at once. Sometimes they wound themselves from within. So when you pause here and speak her name, you are not remembering only a single death. You are standing at a threshold in Alexandria's story, where the old intellectual city still breathes, yet already senses its own breaking point. Her memory survives because it lets you feel the sorrow of a civilization that did not simply end, but fractured before it disappeared from sight. You move forward in time now, and Alexandria changes once again. The ancient city does not vanish, but it is recast under new rulers, new priorities, and a new religious and political horizon. In the 7th century, Arab armies entered Egypt, and Alexandria, long tied to the Greek, Roman, and Byzantine worlds, became part of an expanding Islamic order. For a city with such an immense past, this might sound like an ending. But as you walk through Alexandria in your mind, you begin to see that history here rarely ends cleanly. It bends, it adapts, it survives by changing shape. The city no longer held the same unquestioned political position it had once enjoyed, especially as new centers of power rose inland, first at Fustat and later at Cairo. Yet Alexandria still faced the sea, and that alone gave it a future. The harbor remained its lifeline, trade continued, ships still approached the coast, goods, messages, and travelers still moved through the port. The city was smaller in influence than in its grandest ancient days, but it was not erased. Instead, it entered a different chapter, one in which its Mediterranean identity remained strong even as its place within the Islamic world deepened. So when you stand in this period of Alexandria's past, you're standing in a city learning how to live after empire without surrendering its character. It no longer ruled the imagination of the ancient world in the same way, yet it endured through commerce, memory, and the stubborn fact of location. Alexandria had changed civilizations, but it had not lost itself. The sea still carried its name into distant harbors abroad. You descend now into the catacombs of Qom el-Shokafa, and the city seems to close above you. The light fades, the air cools, stones surround you. What was broad and open along the sea becomes intimate, enclosed, and quiet, as though Alexandria is asking you to leave the surface behind and enter the place where its mixed inheritance was laid gently among the dead. Here, underground, the city reveals one of its deepest truths. Alexandria was never only Greek, never only Egyptian, never only Roman. It was a meeting place, and even in burial, that meeting continued. In the carvings, the forms, and the symbols, you sense traditions crossing into one another. Nothing is entirely separate. Nothing belongs to a single story. That is what makes this place more than a curiosity. Their catacombs are a lesson in identity. They show you that Alexandria did not merely host different peoples side by side. It absorbed, blended, and re-expressed them. Culture here was layered, negotiated, and shared, even when power and belief were contested above ground. So, as you stand below the city, you feel that you are also standing below simple explanations. Alexandria cannot be reduced to one origin or one inheritance. Beneath its streets lies the proof that its soul was composite from the beginning. You rise again toward the coast, and as Alexandria returns to open air and salt wind, you feel the city turning back to the sea. By the Mamluk period, the vast imperial capital of antiquity was long gone, yet the shoreline still mattered. Harbor still mattered, and the need to guard this edge of Egypt had become urgent once more. This is the Alexandria of walls, watchfulness, and survival. The city was smaller than the Alexandria of the Ptolemies or the Romans, but it remained strategically important. Threats could come by water, and power in the eastern Mediterranean was never secure for long. So the coastline demanded strength, and stone answered that demand. That is why Fort Quebec matters so much. It does more than dominate the harbor. It tells you how cities endure. Built in the 15th century, the fort rose on a site already famous across the ancient world where the Pharos Lighthouse had once stood. A wonder became a stronghold. Illumination gave way to defense. Yet the change does not feel like erasure. It feels like adaptation. Alexandria had learned century after century to rebuild itself from what remained. Old stones found new purposes. Ancient prestige became medieval necessity. The city no longer claimed the same intellectual or royal centrality, but it still faced the sea with determination. So when you stand again by the harbor in this era, you understand that survival is also a form of greatness. Alexandria endures not because it remained unchanged, but because it accepted the burden of becoming something new. You pass now into a quieter Alexandria, one less grand in memory perhaps, but no less important for what it preserved. Under Ottoman rule, the city no longer stood at the center of Mediterranean imagination as it once had. Its ancient fame endured in books and recollection, yet daily life moved on a smaller scale, with fewer claims to world importance and fewer monuments to announce its presence. And still, this quieter city mattered. Ports do not need splendor to remain alive. Alexandria continued as a coastal settlement tied to trade, fishing, movement, and local survival. It breathed in a lower register. The noise of empire had faded, but the city itself had not disappeared. That is the lesson of this period. Not every century needs spectacle to shape the future. Some centuries simply keep a place alive long enough for history to turn back toward it. Alexandria endured in that way, quietly, patiently, almost beneath notice. So as you walk through this Ottoman chapter, you feel not decline alone, but persistence. The city waits, survives, and holds its place by the sea until reinvention comes. In silence, it gathers strength for coming return that will soon reshape it completely. You enter the 19th century and feel Alexandria wake again. The city that had endured through quieter ages now begins to expand with new force, new purpose, and new energy. Under Muhammad Ali, Egypt turned toward reform, military strength, and economic transformation, and Alexandria, because of its position on the Mediterranean, became essential once more. Now the city is no longer defined mainly by memory. It is defined by motion. Ships come and go in growing numbers. Warehouses rise. Docks thicken with labor. Roads, canals, and new systems of transport bind Alexandria more tightly to the interior of Egypt and more directly to the markets of Europe. Cotton, commerce, administration, and foreign exchange give the city a new rhythm, faster and more modern than the one that came before. As you walk through this reborn Alexandria, you can imagine consuls, merchants, laborers, sailors, and byrants arriving from many directions. Arabic, Greek, Italian, French, Armenian, and other languages begin to sound through its streets again. Investment changes the skyline. Opportunity changes the population. The harbor becomes not only a local asset, but an international engine. This rebirth does not erase the older city beneath it. Rather, it builds over buried centuries and draws strength from Alexandria's old advantage, its location between Egypt and the wider sea. Muhammad Ali recognized that geography could be turned into power, and Alexandria became one of the clearest proofs of that vision. So when you stand by the harbor in this century, you are standing inside a city returning to itself in a new form. Alexandria is becoming a modern port, a commercial capital, and a gateway through which Egypt meets the wider world again. The old Mediterranean city, once royal, once Roman, once diminished, now breathes with renewed ambition. It has not recovered its past. It has done something harder. It has made a future from it, and you can feel history turning outward here, toward trade, movement, confidence, and possibility. You walk now into Marshea and the downtown streets of modern Alexandria, and the city changes its mood once more. Here the past is not buried under the sea or hidden in ruins. It stands before you in facades, balconies, tram lines, shop fronts, squares, and cafes, in the habits of urban life itself. This is the Alexandria that many remembered in the early 20th century as cosmopolitan, elegant, restless, and deeply connected to the wider Mediterranean world. As you move through these streets, you imagine hearing many languages at once. Arabic is everywhere because this is Egypt. But around it, you can also hear Greek, Italian, French, Armenian, Ladino, and English, each carrying its own community, history, and ambition. Merchants speak in one language and write contracts in another. Newspapers circulate, cafes fill with conversation. The city feels public in a way that is unmistakably urban, full of exchange, style, and observation. This is also the Alexandria of poets, clerks, traders, dock workers, teachers, bankers, and dreamers. It is the Alexandria associated with Constantine Cavafy, whose poetry still seems to belong to streets like these, where memory and desire walk side by side. Yet you should not romanticize too quickly. This world was beautiful, but it was not simple. Some prospered more than others. Some belonged more securely than others. Cosmopolitan life could be generous, but it could also be unequal, layered by class, privilege, and access. Still, as you walk these avenues, you understand why this Alexandria lingers in memoir and imagination. It offered a way of being modern that felt open to the sea, alert to literature, commerce, and conversation, and comfortable with complexity. Trams passed, ships unloaded, letters arrived from abroad, people dressed for business, for ceremony, for evening visits, for the simple pleasure of being seen in a city that watched itself closely. And that is why downtown Alexandria remains so moving. It is not only a place of buildings. It is a place of social memory, where the modern city once believed it could contain many worlds without giving up its own. You feel its charm, but also its fragility, because every cosmopolitan age carries the question of how long openness, balance, and coexistence can endure. When history begins to harden around, you move now into the Alexandria shaped by revolution, sovereignty, departure, and profound social change. The city you have been walking through, with its multilingual cafes, merchant houses, tram lines, and Mediterranean ease, does not disappear in a single instant. But the middle decades of the 20th century alter its character decisively. Politics enters everyday life with greater force, and the meanings of class, a nation, property, and belonging are rewritten. After the 1952 revolution, Egypt begins to define itself through a new political language, one centered on independence, social transformation, and the rejection of old hierarchies. In Alexandria, these changes are felt not only in government offices or public speeches, but in neighborhoods, businesses, schools, and family histories. How nationalization, reform, and the restructuring of public life reshaped the city from within. For many communities that had long formed part of Alexandria's cosmopolitan fabric, this was also an age of departure. Greeks, Jews, Italians, Armenians, Levantines, and others saw their place altered by politics, economics, war, and the changing definitions of citizenship and power. Apartment, storefronts, clubs, the schools, and commercial networks that had once embodied one version of Alexandria gradually belonged to another. Memory remained, but the city's balance changed. Yet you should not hear this chapter only as loss. Alexandria was becoming more fully, more unmistakably, and more publicly Egyptian in a modern national sense. New priorities, new voices, and new social expectations claimed space. The city's older cosmopolitan identity did not vanish completely, but it was recast under different pressures and loyalties. So as you walk here, looking at buildings that still carry traces of earlier worlds, you feel both continuity and rupture at once. Alexandria remains layered, but the layering has changed. The modern city now speaks in a firmer national voice, carrying within it memories of departure, dignity, adaptation, and reinvention. And in that changed voice, you hear not the end of Alexandria, but another turning in its long, unfinished conversation with history. You come at last to the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, and here Alexandria faces its own memory with unusual honesty. This is not the ancient library restored stone for stone, scroll for scroll. It is something different and in some ways more meaningful, a modern declaration that the city still wishes to be associated with learning, preservation, inquiry, and the open exchange of ideas. As you stand before the great circular form of the building, angled toward the light and near the sea, you feel both continuity and distance. The ancient library belongs partly to history and partly to legend. What was lost cannot simply be summoned back into being, but memory can still inspire architecture, institutions, and hope. That is what this place offers. Not resurrection, but renewal. Inside the idea of this building is a question Alexandria has asked for centuries. How does a city honor what made it famous without becoming trapped by nostalgia? The answer here is forward-looking. The Bibliotheca does not exist to imitate the past. It exists to continue a conversation with it. It gathers books, scholarship, visitors, and cultural life in the belief that knowledge remains one of the most dignified ways a city can understand itself. So as you look at this modern library facing the Mediterranean, you understand that Alexandria's story is not only one of ruin, conquest, and departure, it is also a story of return through imagination, through effort, and through institutions built for the future. The sea still lies before the city. The desire to learn still rises behind its walls. And Alexandria, after everything, still turns towards the world with a book in its hand. You return at last to the shore where the Mediterranean opens before you, and a whole long history of Alexandria seems to gather in the wind. By now, you have walked through royal ambition, Roman order, religious struggle, buried memory, medieval defense, modern rebirth, and the changing hopes of the 20th century. Yet, as you stand here again, the city resists any final summary. It refuses to become only Greek, only Egyptian, only ancient, only modern. Alexandria has always been larger than a single definition. That is why the sea matters so much. It reminds you that this city was made for contact, for arrivals, for departures, for exchange, for risk. Ships came carrying grain, books, soldiers, merchants, pilgrims, exiles, and dreams. Empires claimed Alexandria. Faiths reshaped it. Communities built it, mourned it, left it, and remade it. Still, the city remained, never untouched, never finished. And perhaps that is what stays with you most. Alexandria is not great because it preserved everything. It is great because it kept living through loss. It kept turning ruin into foundation, memory into identity, and change into survival. So you stand between water and time, and you understand at last that Alexandria is not merely a place from the past. It is a city that has never stopped becoming itself.